In this topic, you're going to be looking at aqueous solutions. So what does that mean? It means things that are dissolved in water, in this case, aqueous. The subscript we use is a little a and a little q in brackets after things to show that they've been dissolved in water. All right. As part of that, you've got to be able to identify what things are actually dissolved in water and which things are not. And if they are dissolved in water, do they go on to then react with water to make other things? So in other words, what we're looking at is what species, and by that we mean molecules and ions, which species are dissolved in water, so part of the aqueous solution. One of the ways we can do that is we can look at the pH of a solution. And you find at the second half of the topic, so after exams, we're going to be looking at acids and bases that aren't what you'd expect to be acids and bases, so the salts of weak acids and weak bases, basically. To start with, we're actually going to be looking at things that dissolve and things that we call insoluble. But actually now we're going to realise that they do dissolve, just not very well. But before we can go into that, I want us to get this idea of recognising species in solution. So the first thing I'm going to have is a salt solution, and by that I mean sodium chloride. And we would expect in a sodium chloride solution